and to Judy for her continuing guidance to us. If you are a guest today and would like to hear more talks and get involved with Oceanids, please go to our website. I think it's in the chat. It's oceanids@ucsd.edu. Oceanids is a social and service organization of UC San Diego. It was started in 1952 at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. We give graduate fellowships and support other undergraduate and postdoctoral activities and welcome newcomers to campus. That's how I found out about Oceanids way back when, many years ago. Sounding Board is a series of 7 lectures by eminent experts during the academic year. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Peter Cowhey as our speaker. Dr. Cowhey, as many of you may know, is Dean Emeritus and Qualcomm Chair Emeritus of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He's an expert on the future of communications and information technology markets, technology markets and policy, specializing in U.S. trade policy, foreign policy, the internet, and international corporate strategy. His 2 most recent books are Digital DNA, Disruption and the Challenges for Global Governance, and Transforming Global Information and Communication Markets, the Political Economy of Innovation. Dr. Cowhey served in the Obama administration as the senior counselor to the U.S. Trade Representative, and in the Clinton administration as head of international policy at the Federal Communications Commission. Dr. Cowhey received a BSFS degree in foreign service from Georgetown University, an MA degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Ph.D. in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He joined the UC San Diego faculty in 1976. Dr. Cowhey's topic for today's talk is very timely, particularly in light of the FBI director's recent congressional testimony. Dr. Cowhey will speak on, will cyber attacks turn out the lights in the US? There will be questions at the end. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cowhey as we find out, will cyber attacks turn out the lights in the US? It's an honor to have you here, Dr. Cowhey.
Well, thanks very much, Barbara, for inviting me. It may be a more pertinent question. Will the storm turn out the lights in San Diego? But what I'd like to do is use this time together to do 2 things that has been around my career, taking a look at a technologically complex challenge in the digital realm, and also trying to help people understand how good policy analysis breaks down those challenges so that you can go beyond the sort of headlines and have questions to ask, to probe, if you would, the likelihood of the various claims you read, even in, if you would, the mainstream press. So let's get started. Now, the cybersecurity issues about the electric grid in the United States really have generated an enormous number of wonks, producing various scenarios about cyber conflict and cyber disaster. And that, of course, has spilled over into popular fiction. Here are 2 examples. A few years ago, there was a big TV docudrama, that means kind of factual, but not very, called American Blackout, entirely about the American grid crashing. And even more pertinently, we had Bruce Willis star in Live Free or Die #4, in which the central plot of disaster was a cyber attack on the United States taking out the grid. Now, if Bruce Willis was always on standby availability with the guns conveniently strapped to his shoulder, maybe we shouldn't worry about this problem too much. but Bruce has actually retired. And so we are left with a standing source of vulnerability. Now, it's not just that we can dream up how these attacks might take place. They do take place periodically, although less frequently than you would guess from fiction or even the policy wonk scenarios. But 2016 in the Ukraine was a pretty good example of this story. In 2016, the Ukraine electric grid was hacked. So this is before the war broke out by a couple of years, several years in advance. And it occurred because hackers essentially remotely threw the breakers on the grid circuits and then had installed malware in the monitoring systems that overlooked the grid. And therefore, the actual downing of the breakers didn't get reported to the central control centers in time, and that caused the grid to crash for a little less than 100,000 people in the Western Ukraine. We know that at the early onset of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that there was a cyber attack on the grid, but it failed. And it failed for a number of reasons, but the principal reason was the 2016 incident had alerted the Ukrainian authorities and Ukraine's allies that there was this vulnerability, and special steps had been taken to shore up, if you would, the stability of the grid. The other thing I'll just add here as a parenthetical comment was that the United States did the extraordinary thing in cybersecurity strategy, which was, if you'll recall, President Biden announced that the Ukraine was going to invade, which meant that he was disclosing our penetration of the Russian command and control networks. But that was one way to make sure that the Ukraine was really fully prepared for something bad happening in a very short period of time. And it's interesting to note that while the Ukraine electric grid has gone down periodically for short moments during the war, those have been basically the result of missile attacks, not cyber attacks. Still, this is proof of concept in a vivid way. And the question is, will cyber attacks turn out the lights here? So when we start that, we're dealing with the larger question of what keeps the electric grid stable and performing across time in a way that we can rely on it. And you've then got to say, where do cyber attacks fit in that picture? So ask yourself for a second, what are the two biggest causes of electrical outages in the US? We actually have pretty good data about this. You can fill in the answer in your own mind. You don't have to tell me or put it in the chat. So here's the answer: trees and squirrels. If you want the grid to be more reliable, get rid of both of them. If you decide you want to live with them, understand that the grid, at least at the local level, and this is predominantly a local problem, is going to be subject to occasional outages. You may have read that the electricity rates for PG&E up in the Bay Area have now gone up to be higher than here in San Diego, an all-time first. And one of the reasons for that is that tree clearing has now become a major expensive priority for PG&E for two reasons. The first is sparks from the grid can cause forest fires at enormous cost to the state. And the second is that the grid was suffering from trees overhanging the grid and causing spot outages along the way. And this required, if you would, a major pruning of the risk. So you might say to yourself, well, we know that there are these risks, and we know that there's a cyber risk. Bruce told us that for sure, and the Ukraine proved he was right. So why don't we just fix this? Isn't this something just good engineering and a little money could solve? And that is a perennial type of question we ask about many technology problems, especially in the digital space. But I'm going to take you now for a minute or two into two policy lessons that Bruce didn't master and caused him grief, and will cause us grief in the future because the perennial policy challenges. Here's the first of these lessons, which is how we define the problem often depends on who's defining the problem. In other words, key problems are rarely solo problems. They intersect with other problems. And you have to decide on an order of priority. And right now, in dealing with the US electric grid, we are dealing with a critical infrastructure that has contending priorities for its reform. And there's a legitimate conflict among these policy priorities. I'm going to tell you, every politician is likely to say, oh no, we're America, we can do three things at once. It's not true. Normally, we don't do three things at once. We may start on doing three things at once, but what we actually get done in prioritization is a key choice in policy. Right now, one of the things that we are looking at, and I'll show you some numbers later, is how do we make the electric grid in the United States compatible with a more sustainable set of energy sources? That is a very complex and expensive challenge. Cybersecurity is a different set of challenges. The price tag for cyber security improvements is relatively small to renewing the grid for renewable energy, but it's not just that it's cheaper, it's that budgets are finite, and the budgets required for those other priorities are huge. The money left for cyber is often limited, and just as importantly, management attention is limited, and it's a very complicated system to fix for reasons I'm going to explain. So here's the second lesson that you've all learned in your work lives, but it's important to remember does not disappear just because we have impressive technological and engineering talent. It does not disappear just because there are massive budgets in the public sector, et cetera. And that is, when you're solving a big strategic problem, you've got to look at the feasibility of implementation of any plan to fix the problem. And that includes not just budgets, but legislative authorities if it deals with public policy, which the electric grid very much is entangled in. And those implementation problems are very acute in fixing or modifying the electric grid of the United States to deal with cybersecurity. Some countries, like Israel, have centralized authority over big public infrastructure like water and electricity. The national government runs it, so to speak, controls it top to bottom. In the United States, which is essentially a federal system of governmental control, we have a very complicated system of state, local, and national federal control of the electric grid. And all those components are involved in any plan to, quote unquote, fix the grid. Now, if you ignore these two lessons, there is an outcome. This is where a lot of strategic plans for fixing stuff end up. And I might add, for those of you who are scientists and engineers on this call, it's surprising how many national academies of sciences and engineering studies and recommendations end up somewhere behind that desk. Okay, why is the grid so complicated to fix in the United States? In a little more detail. Well, the first reason is that there is no national grid. Now, this may astonish you. You're in New York, you're in Florida, you're in Texas, you're in California. There's electricity everywhere, and they say that they're somehow tied to the grid, whatever that is. But in fact, the United States is organized around a series of regional grids. And each of those regional grids have a governance structure made up of the major suppliers and distributors of electricity in that region. Some grids actually cross national borders. That's the story of, if you could think of the New York area and Quebec, for example. This is just a map of all those major grid intersections. And as you will see, these grids are by and large, regional grids are by and large multi-state. So there are also multi-state regulatory authorities, each state regulatory commission. Now there is an exception to this. God bless them, Texas. They're on their own, always. And that's been a deliberate choice by Texas, which doesn't want Texas electricity to rely on anything to do with those damn Westerners or anybody else. So that's the picture. There is no national grid. There is some interconnection among the regional grids. But your primary grid structure is regional, it's multi-state, it's multi-governmental authority in state authorities or local authorities in some dimensions. And then there is a federal overlay because we do have transmission lines, as I'll show you, that cross across the regions in order to interconnect among the regions, but they do not actually constitute the grid as a whole. Here's the grid. Now, this is a picture from the National Academy of Engineering. It is dumbed down enough for people like me to sort of understand it, and I'm not going to even spend the minutes to lay this out in detail. But I want you to get the general sense of it because it will make sense of a couple of the policy challenges in a moment. At least in the grid the way it existed 30 years ago, in an age of sustainable distributed energy generation, it looks a little less like this today. But the concept is still true, even if it's much more complicated in implementation. You get electric generating stations. No San Onofre up the coast, that was a classic example. Those generating stations generate electricity, and they go through a step that's called a step-up transformer. In other words, they're turned into a higher voltage system in the step-up transformers to go across the main, if you would, backhaul, the big high-duty, heavy-duty electric lines, which transmit electricity at very high kilovoltage levels. Those go, in this simplified area, eventually to, call it San Francisco or San Diego, where they have to be stepped down from that big high voltage story into a lower voltage delivery system that can be handled for local use. It goes first to a series, if you would, regional substations, called SDG&E, who take that and then put it into a regional distribution system. And the regional distribution system has some relatively high voltage customers. Call that General Atomics, which needs some really high voltage uses. And it has the stuff that's powering you on Zoom today at the household level. Okay? That's the grid. And now just multiply it over millions of points. Okay? So to say that that we have a national grid is to say that those high voltage transmission lines that run across state boundaries, and that's an important qualification. Those high voltage lines that run across state boundaries constitute the national grid. But for you as users who need reliable power, generate it reliably, distribute it reliably, that's not the grid, it's a piece of the grid. And there is no national grid in the sense that Israel has one. So Once you understand that the grid is a system of many major pieces, we can start to look at the risks to the grid for its reliability. And now I've got to take you into a little bit of real wonkiness. When I'm talking about cybersecurity strictly as the system for your bank's electronic transmissions and records, we talk about a triad of availability, confidentiality, and integrity. Keep the stuff confidential, keep the records safe without being juggled, and keep the system available. Okay? Of those, we actually rate integrity and confidentiality as the highest things that you're rating the system against. And then you're trying to maximize availability within that space. Okay? With electricity, you don't want the lights to go out. So availability is the highest constraint, and integrity and confidentiality have to fit within the availability constraint. And by and large, the modern grid is highly available on a highly reliable basis. But because it's available, it means that the problem of fixing the grid, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, is actually harder than it is to make banks cyber secure. So here are some pieces that the National Academy in its comprehensive study of risks to the grid identified. For those big generation stations, the highest risk is earthquakes, bigger earthquakes, or they're huge storms, or sea rise and floods. Even geomagnetic storms, which actually did take down the grid in the Northeast at one point a number of years ago, are big risks. Notice what isn't there. Cybersecurity. You can read through these other categories and you discover that it's only when you get to distribution. Remember that local component? These last two sets, that cyber attacks make the list as a moderate risk. All these other risks are, in the judgment of the National Academy after an extensive review, far bigger and more likely risks. Remember how you define the problem defines how you solve the problem? Now you're starting to get a flavor of the problem for cybersecurity. Now, let me give you a little bit about the budget considerations and the implementation issues that I referred to earlier. We have a grid system in the United States that is old, partly because we, unlike Europe or Japan, for example, did not have our electric grid substantially destroyed by a world war. And so there are a lot of old pieces in the grid that are hanging around. They aren't usually pre-World War II, but the age of the grid is quite high. It's on average, the equipment is 34 years old, whereas the more recently rebuilt grids of Europe and Japan and the emerging grids of high growth developing economies are usually younger in their equipment. And age has an implication, depreciation and replacement. So you can't exactly know the value in modern financial terms of the current electric grid with all of its equipment and transmission systems, et cetera. But it's roughly estimated somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 trillion. And its replacement cost, and this is a 2017 replacement cost. So remember, we've had a major inflation wave that hit after that. So take it up a notch. About $5 trillion to modernize the grid to modern standards. That is a lot of money. That's about a quarter of the US gross domestic product in a given year. All right. Take a more limited charge. You want to make the grid capable of being sophisticated enough to handle the new era of renewable energy, which is a much more complicated problem because now all those rooftop panels, which many of you have, or UCSD has on its buildings, they're all independent sources of transmission of power. And they have to be coordinated into a system to deliver on a reliable basis. And while I won't go into the engineering, the stability of the grid depends on, in a sense, keeping harmony in the voltage in the system within a certain range of vibration, if you would, as a metaphor. And doing this is very complicated. It's also doable, we know, but it's complicated. And to modernize the grid enough to deal with the level of renewable energy that we want in the grid mix of the future is going to cost almost $350 billion alone for the grid's modernization. It's a lot of money. And even while I say that, the annual investment in modernizing the grid is not keeping up with the incremental cost of depreciation for the grid as a whole. Selective pieces of the grid are getting modernized, but the system as a whole is not catching up. All right? So money matters. Priorities matter. Okay, so let me take you then to looking purely at the security part of the grid and cybersecurity itself. The grid is being made more secure against cyber attacks. Everything I've said sounds terribly gloomy, but in fact, the grid is more secure against cyber attacks than it was, 20 years ago. Certainly more secure even than it was 10 years ago. Is it as secure as we would like optimally if we had a perfect world? No. But it's also important to understand that how we're making the grid more secure is consistent with the evolution of how we're making everything more secure in the major pieces of the American economy and infrastructure. So what we're doing with the grid is the same as what we're doing with water. It's the same as what we've done with banks. It's the same thing that we're trying to do with all of our major functional institutions in America. The pace of change differs by circumstance, but the strategy is the same, and the strategy is much different than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the notion of cybersecurity was build a wall around the system, just keep out the intruders. The FBI director was talking about hackers in his testimony. Keep out the hackers. Well, as cybersecurity analysis has gotten more sophisticated, we realize that's a fool's paradise. It cannot and does not work. You can, however, take a different strategy. And the strategy that is generally followed looks like this. First thing you do is you identify the system you're trying to secure. You actually got to know the boundaries of what you're trying to secure in order to analyze it. So you identify the assets, the systems within connecting the assets, etc. Just as we saw that picture of the grid earlier, is one crude way of mapping the physical infrastructure. And then within it, we can look at, if you would, the digital control systems that link the pieces to work together. All right. So you do that as a holistic analysis. And then you assess risks of that holistic analysis to ask who's threatening with what consequences and what vulnerabilities in order to judge where the biggest chunks of vulnerability are with the highest likelihood of occurrence. And that is how we set priorities nowadays. Now, here I will tell you that one of the big advances we've made with this line of attack is that it really brought people to focus on the system control and data acquisition systems in the backbone grid. If you want to knock out a large part of the reliability of regional grids, knock out the reliability of the backbone transmission lines, those high voltage lines. And what's most vulnerable about them? Well, you can physically destroy them, whether by a major storm or whatever else. But you can also, and this is the cyber piece, go after the control system, the computer control system that makes that system work reliably, manages it, monitors it, etc. And there we have done a major overhaul of the software and security controls on the software in the backbone grid at a reasonable cost and with much greater reliability over the last 10 to 15 years. So that's an improvement. But you should understand that the basic theory is you can limit the number of attacks by setting up barriers, but you can't stop all the attacks from being successful. They will penetrate. Biggest source of penetration of attacks on systems that we're trying to secure, like the electric grid, human beings. Humans are always the worst security problem. Love us or leave us, but we're it. So you limit, and by the way, the reason big banks are relatively good at cybersecurity is they can limit the personnel, they know who they are, it's carefully controlled, and they know the type of attacks that they're going to face by and large, and therefore they can game those attacks. Second thing you need is faster response time. You're penetrated. It is going to happen. And when you're penetrated, you've got to identify the penetration and figure out which risks follow from it to quickly contain the damage. That is leading, in the best institutions, to a type of compartmenting of the system. How many of you have to do two-factor authentication on a regular basis now when you sign on to various digital applications? That is a way of providing a partial compartment. Don't just go into the system, you have credentials for a specific application within the system. And finally, you design the system with redundancy and other factors that allow you to restore the system faster and make it harder to take down the system as a whole. Because one thing that is true with the grid is that the longer it's down, the harder it is to restore. So you want it restored as fast as possible, at least in pieces and bits, as fast as you can. And then after that, you try to figure out ways of measuring effectiveness, often by simulated attacks and scenario exercises. Well, that's all fine. It's not perfect, but it will make us a lot more secure. But then we come to the problem of authority. And it turns out that the national government doesn't have control over much of the grid. It has control over what's called the bulk power system, those transmission lines across interstate areas. And there, the federal government has set reliability standards that include a whole bunch of technical fixes, a whole bunch of, if you would, personnel and policy procedures for that part of the grid. But they don't control the rest of the grid. The rest of the grid is controlled by the states and the local authorities. And even within the federal piece, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation is, underneath the congressional statutes, a partner to the federal government, and that represents the system owners and operators who, of course, are worried about their budgets, and therefore the feds can't simply say the ideal solution is this. They've got to convince their partners in the Reliability Corporation that it's manageable under the budget systems. And what we're watching play out over the last 10 years is a cat and mouse game to try to increase the overall authority of the feds over the system and both their area of immediate jurisdiction and indirect jurisdiction. Let me show you what I mean by that. When the Biden administration invested to modernize the grid in order to deal with service to remote areas that didn't have modern grid service, or to make it better to deal with renewables like wind energy, it was able to smuggle into the procurement rules for the federal money new cybersecurity standards. But that was only for those projects. Now, coming to the end, to the questions being resolved. This is just a list, I'm not going to read to you, of the point that I made to you earlier, that accessibility at all times is the limiting factor in everything else we do. And these are all the things that the National Academy of Engineering points out are problems in trying to modernize the grid wholesale or quickly, including for those software systems and control systems that patches and upgrades require rigorous, prolonged testing before deployment. And if you are trying to monitor the system for attacks, the way that you monitor the network can actually interfere with some of the older equipment on the network, thus affecting reliability. This is not an easy problem. It's a piecemeal problem that we solve in a piecemeal way. So what's the answer to the Bruce Willis question? The answer is that today, the backbone transmission grid is fairly secure. Not perfectly secure, but fairly secure and much more secure than it used to be. That's partly because we've been able to force modernization by regulation and somewhat by federal spending to help with modernization. And it's also because regulation has required that the utilities have much better trained and organized cybersecurity staffs that are often absent at the local level. There was a Florida blackout of an electric grid locally in Florida. I think it was 2 years ago. It was almost entirely because they had no personnel for cybersecurity. And I'll add one other thing. At the national level, military security cyber deterrence is a help. When people say Russia or China will try to take down the backbone grid, they should remember, and Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, does know this, that if China and Russia actually tried to take down our backbone grid and succeeded, as opposed to playing and probing, they're not the only people who are doing this. Look to Washington, D.C. and its immediate suburbs, and you will see the largest cyber war capability in the world. What do they do with that? Sit there and just sit around and go, wouldn't it be nice? Their job is to establish capabilities around the world, and the other sides know that as well. So there is a deterrence factor. So we are more secure, but at the local level, and if you would, not the full regional level, but an extended region, partial regional level, we still have cybersecurity vulnerabilities that are higher, and they are going to require fixing. And for all the reasons I've listed, it's going to be a slow process to improve that security factor. Thanks very much. I'll gladly answer any questions you have.
Dr. Cowhey, thank you for a very stimulating and important presentation. I can tell that we're going to have quite a few questions. So let us begin. If you would please raise your hand like this, or with the hand raise option on your video, please, and then unmute yourself. Let's take a look at questions. Dr. Vacquier.
I have a question. Is this cybersecurity a political issue, or do you think it could be something where if that there could be bipartisan to try to beef things up or to spend money on improvements, et cetera?
The answer to, as in many areas like cybersecurity technology questions, is in theory, we have bipartisan agreement. We should be more secure. Who's going to argue against that? I'm running in the presidential primary, and I'm announcing that I would like us to be less secure. It's not going to fly. So there is agreement about that, and that does get you some progress. But then you get to the stuff that is political. Like, for example, should we allow the national government, the White House, and its staff, and the Department of Homeland Security, which they are currently trying to impeach the secretary in the House, to tell the state of Texas or the state of California or Wyoming or Minnesota that your rules about cybersecurity are inadequate. You have to do the following things to modernize your equipment and have these personnel and practices and training practices, etc. That's when it becomes political. So at the implementation level, the choices you must make to implement the general agreement that we should be doing better, what you do is you avoid all sorts of things you should be doing to focus on the few things where nobody really has a bone to pick, or at least not too many bones to pick. And we have made progress that way. We're smarter than we were. We are more secure, but there are limits.
I have a question. You were just on a slide where there was a statement, deterrence against big state actors. Can you tell me what types of deterrents are in place now?
I'll tell you a story, okay? Because that's the best way I can answer the question. So I had been in the Obama administration and at a position that was the functional equivalent of a deputy secretary of a cabinet department in one of the economic agencies, the trade rep, which is located in the White House. Anybody who's had that experience gets called periodically to take part in various war game and simulations and scenarios about decision making. So this was being held in Washington, and it was explicitly about how should the U.S. prepare and think about a cyber attack from, in this case, it was Russia, okay? And this is really what you hear about in the term of war gaming, where you essentially simulate the decision-making. So I was in this scenario, the Secretary of Treasury, and we had a full key cabinet posts there. We had the military, and to give you a sense, most of us were at least at my level of experience or even more senior. And the military was represented by 2-star generals who were let out of school for the day, so to speak. And the war game scenario evolved. And at some point, as tensions escalated and threats about cyber attacks were rising, a significant part of the ATM network in the US goes down. And there's a possible source of that being a cyber attack. Matter of fact, you guess it's most likely, but it wasn't 100% certain. And, but it was a sufficiently complex event that attribution to it being Russia under this scenario set of conditions made it unlikely that it was a private group of hackers. And China was not playing a big role in this scenario. So the question was, what do we do? And so the civilian cabinet, as happens in these circumstances, has a discussion about what would be an appropriate response to Russia, where you don't want to get into a slugging war, but you also don't want to be a patsy, right? So finally, we come up with a statement to the military people, including people from Cyber Command. And we said, we want a bread box, a digital bread box that sort of looks like within these parameters, X, Y, and Z, available and probably to use it. And it was a balancing act. We didn't want to do anything too radical, but we wanted to really show that we had a hammer. And the military guys caucused for a while, and they came back and they said, well, what if there was suddenly in the electric grid of Russia a ping on the network that any network operator could recognize as an intrusion that challenged their ability to control the network? Wouldn't take down the network, they just recognize it could happen. We said, really good idea. That's what I mean by these capabilities and deterrence. You're signaling that capabilities for disruption exist on a two-way street. And therefore, acting with step one, I'm disrupting you, opens you to step two, which is we'll do the same to you, either on the exact same thing or a different target of our choosing. And that is just simply true. Now, it's Christopher Wray, as the head of the FBI's job, to try to reduce those avenues of vulnerability, narrow them down as much as possible, because you want to lower the incidence of risk, but you also want to, in a sense, contain the space of risk so that you can watch certain vectors more carefully because you have more confidence you're protecting other areas fairly successfully. And that is the game that is engaged in. I'll give you one other example, maybe a little more dramatic, and it's certainly real life, in my opinion. I can't prove it to you, but I'm pretty convinced it's true, which is when President Biden announced that the Ukraine was going to be invaded, it was an extraordinary act by a US president. This did not happen, in my judgment, and I think most people I know in intelligence agree with this, because we had a spy sitting in Putin's office. Because if it were a human asset, this is a good way to send them to the death penalty quickly, because they'd figure it out. What Biden was telling the Russians was that we had penetrated their command and control system, and we were watching what they were doing. And therefore, they better think very carefully about all of their steps, because we were watching. Does that help answer your question?
Thank you. I just wish that they hadn't gone ahead and attacked Ukraine, but we'll see.
They were going to do that anyway. That's what I mean. What I'm telling you is Biden was watching the orders for attack, but it takes a while to go from the order to the implementation. So Biden just said, in effect, we know what you've done.
Right. Thank you.
We have a question here from Carol Ziegler. Carol, would you unmute yourself and kindly ask your question?
Yeah, so it seems to me, was it last winter or the winter before, that I noticed that you had the map with Texas as an individual operator, basically.
Right.
And that a lot of things went down because of the weather. So I don't know if you count that as cybersecurity, but doesn't that maybe force that government to decide that they better up the possibility of not having the lights go out?
Right. So it's a classic example of what the National Academy of Engineering was saying about risks. Cyber is not at the top of the list of risks. It's things like weather and earthquakes, etc. Okay. So that's the first thing about the Texas story. It fit the risk scenario that the Academy laid out in that table I showed you. Second thing to know about the Texas story was that the Texas problem was worse because, unlike the other regions, Texas does not actively maintain an interconnect to the other regions for backup electric power. It's part of the Texas sovereignty story. And that made the problem worse. And I, at least as of the last time I checked, though, a little while ago, Texas has not reversed that policy. It is true that the governor and his administration were sufficiently embarrassed that they have invested in additional backup and other, if you would, resilience investments within Texas. They also tried to blame it on the fact that renewables were somehow the source of the problem, which was just political palaver to cover up their embarrassment. Renewables are not a free lunch for the grid reliability, but they were not the source of this problem.
Thank you.
We have a question here from Fred Bonwowski. Would you please unmute yourself and ask your question, Fred? Fred, you have a question?
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to come back to Biden and Ukraine. I agree that what he did shortly before the attack occurred was to tell the Russians that we knew they were going to do it. And so we had penetrated something. But it seems to me that while that was perhaps an attempt to cause them not to attack at all, other than that, it was not very successful because it told them we knew about them and had, could penetrate their issues. So what's your judgment on that?
Yeah, it's a fair and a good question. There's a dirty truth about diplomacy, including deterrence diplomacy, which is an example of, which is these are very imperfect instruments. And as far as I can tell from friends of mine in the administration, there was no notion they could stop the Russians from invading with that effort. Now, first of all, I should tell you, nobody will officially say that's what exactly happened, the penetration of the command and control system. That's far too sensitive for anybody. I mean, that is a criminal offense if they explicitly said it. As somebody who's had some of those code word secure clearances, you don't mess around with them. But what they will sort of say, so you kind of get the gist of it, is you can't stop them. The orders have already been given. They're going to roll. But what you can do is make the response much better. You can get the Ukrainians to really be aware. Remember, these countries like the Ukraine, or take Estonia, live with a world where they always are worried about the Russians. Ukraine has more of a reason before the war than Estonia, but Estonia is under constant cyber attack from the Russians. It's just a fact of life. And I mean at an intense level. And so what they were doing was helping Zelensky mobilize an all-out effort to be ready the last second. And that included things like the cybersecurity preparations. But the second thing was they were mobilizing the rest of NATO in diplomacy to have a strong response right off the bat. What you didn't want if you were sitting in the administration was for NATO to spend 2 weeks trying to figure out what they were going to say. What you wanted was NATO, having been forewarned in the most visible possible way by its leading member that this is going to happen, to be ready to respond and respond immediately with, yes, we're going to help. And in that sense, it did matter, and it was an improvement. But you're quite right. These things are limited instruments. They can only do so much.
Thank you. Other questions?
Rich has his hand raised.
Oh, good. Rich, please. Thank you. Rich?
Well, yes, thank you. Yeah, Doctor, thank you for a very interesting talk. That's fascinating. I used to work kind of in this environment years ago. I ran a ethical hacking group. We were paid to be the bad guys and to break into various systems. And
Great.
yeah,
Your
and it was
imagination is probably far richer than mine on this subject.
well, I doubt it, but I guess the point I want to make is we were able to get into pretty much anybody we wanted to get into. At banks, we opened our own accounts, we put money in our own accounts, we opened up charge cards. We could get into hospitals very
Right.
easily and look at psych data, HIV data. I mean, any hospital in this country or basically any bank. And so I guess when I've studied this in the past, I think one of the issues we've got, and it's political, for the most part, is you got so many different agencies involved in this problem. You got the Defense Department, you got Justice, you got Department of Commerce, you got Homeland Security, yada, yada, yada. And it seems like they need a more centralized approach than the federated approach they're on now. That's never going to happen just because of all the bureaucratic infighting and the typical Potomac two-steps that go on in Washington. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that? It just seems like there needs to be a different management approach to this whole thing. Because if you take banks and hospitals, they're totally different organizations. They're both supposed to be highly secured. They both had their individual vulnerabilities that with anybody with any knowledge of their systems could easily get into. And I'm sure that's not changed at all and probably been enhanced today with all the different tools that are out there now on the black web, that dark web that you can get access to, former NSA tools, former CIA tools, former FSR tools. I mean, they're all out there. So kind of rambling question, but what do you think?
Well, I think we significantly agree here. Let me break it down into a handful of portions to your comment. As I said, the notion that you can create some sort of a wall that can't be penetrated has disappeared. Yet 20 years ago, that was still an operational approach that had great favor. And eventually, both good engineering logic, it was shown that there is no such thing as foolproof software, absolutely, that can't be penetrated, and human factors and use cases, etc., all show that the notion you're going to shut out all attacks, impossible. But I think what has evolved in response is an effort to, again, limit attack vulnerability. And I've been at dinner with the heads of cybersecurity for some of the big global banks, and their stories of their scale of operation and the number of attacks they fend off in the tens of thousands per day, et cetera, are ones you're familiar with. So they're pretty good at it, and they say they're best at it about things that are known use threat vectors where they can sort of get defense in depth at the perimeter. But even they don't believe that they're foolproof. And that leads to this evolution that monitoring for quick response and then segmenting the system. And you'll know this jargon, zero trust design in the system is all a way of trying to limit the damage and allow for faster response. And then redundancy in certain key capabilities matters. So none of these are perfectly secure approaches. And your point about the dark web, just so for those of you who don't know about this, there are the equivalents to eBay on the dark web where you can buy and bid for whatever cyber hacking tools you want. It's quite amazing if you take a look at it. So, and they also have, by the way, customer feedback, and there are cyber hackers who have 4-star ratings for reliability of their tools, and others 3 stars, et cetera. But then to get to your last point about the federal response, yeah, I think that it's partly bureaucratic turf war. That's always a key issue. As you know, the NSA, the National Security Agency, for those who don't know the acronym, and Cyber Command in the Pentagon have had enormous turf wars, for example, and they only solved it by double hatting the head of them so that the same guy runs both agencies. But how long and how viable a solution that is an open question. So turf wars matter, but it is also a matter of congressional sensibilities. Congress does not like unifying authority like that too extensively for lots of reasons that we could talk about, with both a rolling of eyes and also an appreciation of some of the complex decisions. So yeah, that's part of why implementation never lives up to the fancy strategic plan you read. But you try to get better.
Thank you. Enjoyed the presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. I want to make sure that there isn't someone who has a pressing question whose hand we may have missed. If that is you, please wave more and we will try and get one final question. Dr. Dennis, Martha Dennis. Please unmute yourself, Martha. Unmute. Could you please unmute? Martha, can you unmute? Ah, great, good. I think she's talking.
She's trying. No, she's trying.
Let's
to.
see, can we unmute her, please?
No, I have to, all I can do is ask her.
Martha, would please unmute yourself?
I got it.
Oh, great,
Okay.
perfect, splendid.
All
Please.
right.
Good,
So
all yours.
what do you believe is the biggest threat that you're aware of in cybersecurity from a country point of view?
Well, first, let me add a non-cyber threat that was on the list. One of the biggest threats that we have nowadays is crazies with high-powered rifles who can take out a substation. And securing the substations from physical attack by people with individual weapons is a source of rising anxiety. They're doing a number of things to try to make that harder, but we should bear that in mind. Okay, so now, what's the biggest risk? I wish I could tell you it was only the big three, China, Russia, and North Korea, who are the countries that have the most advanced cyber warfare capabilities outside of the US, the UK, and Israel. France is also pretty good at this. But unfortunately, for the reasons that we just heard in the last intervention, the leak of a number of the NSA hacking tools that took place means that the capabilities of non-state hackers has increased enormously. Now, that non-state group, just vastly simplified, falls into two different types. One type is, if you would, a terrorist group. There's been a lot of thinking in deterrence strategy about non-state actors using cyber war, and people have grown somewhat less concerned about that line of attack because in most cases, the cyber group attacking wants to take credit. And if you take credit, it increases your vulnerability. So while it's not impossible, a terrorist group might do it with sophisticated tools, it's less likely in the estimation of probability than it was 5-7 years ago in our thinking. The other group is, of course, people out for money. It's a blackmail threat. And that's not trivial. I think that there is some feeling that the scale of a cyber attack by criminal blackmail groups on, let's say, the grid is likely to be pretty selective, not a big regional, the Western grid, etc. And the reason for that is found in other forms of cybercrime. When you go on to those dark web hacking spots, and you can buy anything you want for a cyber attack, there is a note on virtually all the sites that says, we will not sell tools for anything that involves child pornography. Well, is this because these criminal websites have an enlightened consciousness about children? Probably not. It's because virtually every country in the world actually has laws against child pornography, and they kind of are likely to enforce them if it becomes obvious. And so it's not worth the business. And a major electric grid takedown, not San Diego would probably not count as major, but you take down California or something like that, may be too big for other countries to ignore. And the criminal risk factor of really broad sharing of intelligence and police action against a group that would do that, because if they did it to California, maybe they do it to us and it would be really big damage. That may be a sort of a deterrent at that scale of criminal activity, but at smaller scales, maybe that's tempting. So one of my worries is really at the, if you would, the sub-regional level, if you would, the metropolitan or smaller town level, where I think the sources of attack possibilities are really broad, not just cyber, but other types of attacks as well. And where the funding for resilience, protection, et cetera, is often skimped on. I mean, and if you want to say, well, isn't that foolish? What happens every time you see the Public Utilities Commission in California approve a rate hike? So those are realities.
Guess I'll sleep I won't sleep tonight.
You should sleep. You know, God, we've been doing these scenarios about cyber attack now pretty heavily for at least 15, 20 years. And the number of actual takedowns of the grid by a cyber attack, very small, very limited. But there is a possibility it could be worse, and that's what you're trying to limit.
Thank you so much for this incredible genius of analysis of this mess.
Martha, you said that so well. Great last question, great summary of appreciation. Dr. Cowhey, it's been truly a very stimulating and important presentation, giving us tools to analyze and think about these issues in a much more complex way. So thank you very much. If we could, I don't know if we can unmute everybody so we can applaud, or at least I will applaud. Thank you very much again. And thank
Thanks
you
for
all for
joining
coming.
me.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank
We're gonna- We'll end the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara, can you stay on?
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks all for coming. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Good work.
Thank you.
Good.
We're
Thank you.
going to have a short meeting amongst the three of us with Judy and me and Barbara.
Oh,
So-
good. A little debrief. See, Liz, goodbye. Hello and goodbye. Liz Wills.